This is video 4 of Tesla Limited, and we are having a look at the required of part B. It says, discuss with reasons how the transaction price in this contract between Tesla and the South Australian government should be determined during the third quarter of Tesla ended 30 September in terms of IFRS 50. Again, look at the note to see things that are excluded, that you do not need to discuss. We try and limit the discussion because IFRS 15 is such a wide standard. What you also need to look at the mark allocation and therefore also the time allocated, just to give you a guideline of what you need to write. So we say in the note, do not discuss all the items the entity needs to consider when determining the transaction price. Only discuss the most relevant items that affect this specific transaction price in the contract. Do not discuss items or circumstances that are not explicitly part of the terms of the contract. You can assume that this contract will not be cancelled or renewed or modified. Do not discuss other information that Tesla might reasonably have available and might consider in estimating the specific measurement of the transaction price. And do not discuss the constraining of a variable consideration. So now that we know what the required is and what not to discuss, what should we then discuss? Well, they asked us, how will the transaction price be determined? But what is the transaction price? And the definition for transaction price comes out of paragraph 47 in IFRS 15. And it says, the transaction price is the amount of consideration to which an entity expects to be entitled in exchange for transferring promised goods or services to the customer. The consideration promised in a contract with the customer may include fixed amounts, variable amounts, or both. So variable amounts, well, if we look at this specific contract, we don't know exactly what we're going to get because it depends. It depends on the outcome of the bet. So we could either get R0 or we could actually receive money. So it's variable. And if we look at paragraph 51, it actually says the promised consideration can vary if an entity's entitlement to the consideration is contingent on the occurrence or non-occurrence of a future event. And that's exactly what happened here. It depends on what? On whether the battery is manufactured, installed, and tested within 100 days. It's contingent upon the occurrence of that event, that we meet the deadline and we win the bet. So the variability relating to the consideration promised in a contract can be explicitly stated in the contract, which it is. It was very explicit on Twitter that they entered into this bet. Now that we know there is a variable amount to this transaction price, what do you do if there is a variable amount? So that is what paragraph 50 tells us. It says, if the consideration promised in a contract includes a variable amount, which it does, an entity shall estimate the amount of consideration to which the entity will be entitled in exchange for transferring the promised goods or services. But how do we estimate? We go and have a look at paragraph 53. An entity shall estimate an amount of variable consideration by using either of the following methods. Depending on which method, the entity expects to better predict the amount of consideration to which it be entitled. Either, not both, so either the expected value, which is the sum of probability weighted amounts in a range of possible considerations, or the most likely amount. The most likely amount may be appropriate if the amount of variable consideration, if the contract has only two possible outcomes, which is exactly what happened here. Either Tesla will receive nothing or Tesla will receive some money. Two possible outcomes. So we are going to have to look at the most likely amount. Now that we have looked at the theory, the paragraphs from the standard, we need to go and apply the theory by using information that was given in the question. So if we look at the application, it says Tesla expects to be entitled to either the 11,450 per kilowatt or R0, depending on whether they win the bet, whether the 100-day deadline is met. And this is very specifically stated in the tweets. Okay, so the promised consideration varies as it is contingent or dependent on meeting the deadline or not, which is a future event. Remember, we are in the third quarter. We are almost around day 60. We don't know yet. In the future, we will only know whether or not the bet will be won. So in this case, Tesla will need to estimate the amount using the most likely amount because there are only two possibilities, being either the R0 or the 11,450 Rand. So now that we have applied all the theory, we used the information given in the question, now we need to make a conclusion. What is the conclusion? Remember, the conclusion needs to address the required. The required was, how will Tesla determine the transaction price? So the conclusion is Tesla will need to estimate which is the most likely amount. In other words, are they most likely to meet the deadline and then be entitled to the 11,450 per kilowatt, or is it most likely that they will not meet the deadline and therefore be entitled to R0? So the transaction price will be determined for the third quarter as the most likely amount between these two possible outcomes.